Hello, everybody. Welcome to CGTN Live, coming to you from a variety of social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our CGTN app. What's going to be the topic tonight? Food security and food safety, because we know that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has worsened the situation for global food supply. Actually, this has already become a problem since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, disruption to spring sowing in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia threaten to create food shortages and drive the agricultural commodity prices even higher. And how bad is the impact of the war likely to have on global food security, and what is the appropriate global response to that? Tonight, we're going to talk about it. Allow me to introduce our guests. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and president of the Schiller Institute. Matteo Marchisio, IFAD representative to China, DPRK, and ROK. Marcia Mary Baker, agriculture editor, editorial board of EIR News Service. Zhang Chuanhong, associate professor at China Agricultural University in Beijing. And Marco Lambertini, WWF International Director General in Switzerland. So, guys, let's start the conversation. The biggest question, the first question I want to ask you is, what are the major causes of the impending food crisis? I want each of you to give me a very brief answer. Helga, let's start with you first.
Well, obviously, before this sanctions were imposed, already more than 800 million people food insecure. But the sanctions made the situation much worse, and I fully agree with the UN General Secretary Guterres, who said that this is weaponizing the world economy and it's undoing the progress made in decades. So I think these sanctions were imposed without any consideration what the spillover effect was on the developing countries, and therefore it is very, very urgent that this be remedied.
And Matteo?
I think it's the result of a combination of factors. I mean, if we observe the food security situation in the world over the past 5 to 6 years, basically food security after many years of improvement has been steadily or to a certain extent worsening. Main factors are conflicts, climate change, climate variability, which made the country's food production affected by floods or droughts, and lately COVID-19 pandemic. The Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine conflict was an additional dimension that further affect food security in the world.
Marcia?
Well, the current strife in Ukraine comes on top of a situation where for decades we've had underproduction of basic food internationally. Take grains, which is a measuring stick. Instead of about 4 billion tons produced annually, we have been only producing less than 3 billion tons. And we have also had a situation where under the principles of the World Trade Organization, there has been a disallowing of food stocks and reserves. So we've become very vulnerable. We have not had the investment in the agriculture supporting projects like water projects and irrigation. So we've become very vulnerable with a few large export source regions in the world, accounting for food which has been insufficient. So now this is an extreme hit on a vulnerable situation we need to mobilize to change.
And Chuan Hong?
Yes, I think Ukraine crisis is definitely the most important reason. However, we know even before Ukraine crisis, many countries around the world were struggling to get access to adequate food supplies following the global-wide economic recession triggered by COVID-19 pandemic. And people in hunger rose by 18% during the pandemic. And this number is expected to go up this year as the Ukraine crisis is deepening the food insecurity. And the United Nations said that the war impacted on the global food market alone could cause an additional 7.6 million to 13.1 million people to go hungry. Of course, before that, we know climate change and also the spillover effect caused by the war is some countries' restriction of food export. All these issues need to be addressed, I think.
And finally, Marco.
Yeah, thank you. But first of all, let me just say that firstly, the war is a human tragedy. And of course, also a massive disruption to the global economy, and particularly today we're talking about food. But I agree with everybody else. It's not like before the war in Ukraine, the world was in a food secure state. The pandemic, climate change. I would also highlight nature loss, deforestation, and other loss of habitats that are impacting climate change and directly and indirectly food security. Were all causes that were already undermining the safe production of food. And the demonstration is what has been said before. Almost 1 billion people are still undernourished in the world. They were before the war as well. So the war is adding further pressure and to already a number of causes that are pointing in the direction of a reform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk about the importance of Russian and Ukraine exports, agricultural exports to the global food market. So I'm going to ask this question to Matteo. How important are Russian and Ukraine exports?
Well, they're very important. As one of the previous speakers was saying, about 1/3 of the global wheat exports in the world come from Russia and Ukraine. About 50 countries in the world depend on cereals from Ukraine and Russia for more than 30% of their imports. And in regions like Middle East, North Africa, and Africa, this percentage comes at 50%. And even in China, which is a country that is overall food self-sufficient and has high reserves, food reserves. About 80% of the imports of maize and 70% of imports on sunflowers comes from Ukraine, and 30% of fertilizer come from Russia. So even a country like China that is food self-sufficient depends or imports a large part of its food from those two countries.
Mm-hmm. And Marco, what does this importance tell us about the sustainability or vulnerability of the global food systems?
Right. So this is highlighting even further the fragility of our food systems today. First of all, let me just remind everyone that we have an over-reliance on a very small number of food and crops. Just 5 crops and 12 animals, farmed animals, produce 75% of the world calories. And so this lack of diversity in our food system means that the system is not resilient enough, and particularly when there are shocks, stresses like war, political instability, geopolitical fractures, but also diseases, pests, pathogens, pandemics, and all this is under further stress. And secondly, we are also relying excessively on intensive monoculture farming that degrades the environment and requires massive mechanical and chemical inputs as well. So soils are increasingly degraded, sterile, pollinators are in steep decline almost everywhere. And all this is a stark reminder of the fact that our natural systems, clean water, regulated water, stable climate, abundant pollinators, healthy soil, are all critical foundations for a sustainable food system. This is where we need to focus our attention to create a food system that is resilient and sustainable by being in a balance with the planet.
And Shanghong, what should China do to sort of plan for the future should this similar types of disruptions happen in the future?
As mentioned by Martel, China to a great extent depends on the import of sunflower oil from Ukraine. And we see not only China, but also European Union and other European countries, were among the top importers of Russia and Ukrainian sunflower oils. For China, I think these days our government are really determined to keep this food security, and it is reflected in several very important documents released this year, including the number one central documents. We keep the red line of 1.8 billion mu. Just use the land to for staple crop planting. That means during this crisis moment, Chinese government really want to keep our food security as a kind of top priority.
Hmm. And other than the war disrupting, spring sowing, what are other, factors driving a rise in global food prices, and what may affect them in the future? I want to ask this question to Helga.
Well, I think that the reason why you have the incredible figure of 800 million people having mostly only one meal a day, being permanently on the verge of starvation, is the result of a totally unjust economic system. I mean, the IMF conditionalities basically made it impossible for entire continents to develop the kind of infrastructure and agriculture which would have remedied the situation very easily. Now, on top of that, the sanctions, I think the Western countries who have imposed the sanctions on Russia, they did not consider, or if they considered it, all the worse, the spillover effect on the developing countries. Now we have a situation where, according to the Chinese economist Liu Shuqin from the Chongyang Financial Institute, he said 1 billion people are threatened with starvation this year. So I think this requires urgent measures. And, I have not seen in the 6 weeks of the war that the Western governments have made steps to double the food production. As a matter of fact, 6 farm organizations in the United States recently went to the US Secretary of Agriculture, Phil Zack, and demanded that some of the set-aside land should be used to plant the crop for this season to, compensate the losses. And he refused it. I think this is intolerable. I think the governments must take measures to increase the food production, because we cannot sit by and look the starvation of 1 billion people. I mean, this says something about our moral character if we do that. So I think, we have to have a mobilization to change that.
And should we worry about, for example, fertilizers or supply chains in the future? Will we see any changes that could affect the entire ecosystem of global food supply? Helga.
Yes, I think we need to have a change in policy which starts with food security in every country. I think this is a question of sovereignty. I think the present crisis shows that we cannot have a dependency, where the food security of entire continents is not guaranteed. So I think we have to have a new system and learn the lesson from this present crisis.
Hmm. And meanwhile, North African and Central Asian countries are known to be largely dependent on wheat and barley imports for their staple foods. So, how is the disruption of global food supplies likely to impact these relatively vulnerable countries? I would like to ask this question to Marcia.
Well, the 18 nations of the Middle East, North Africa region of the world, and this involves something like 450 or more million people, have a very high dependency not only on wheat imports, which is part of the historic cuisine, but from Ukraine and Russia. So there have been individual desperate emergency measures, ranging from Lebanon putting in regulations to use wheat only for bread, for nothing else, rationing in Syria, and other kinds of measures. But the solution to this lies only in an international mobilization for immediate emergency supplies, and then otherwise for upping production in all those regions of the world that can do so. And in the meantime, Egypt, of course, the largest wheat importer of the world, and something like 12 million tons a year, has had an emergency arrangement this very week of financial support to help stabilize the situation. And that comes from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And so financial arrangements and help are absolutely in order throughout the whole region on an individual basis, nation by nation.
And Professor Zhang, in your view, how have the conflict in Ukraine and Russia sanctions impacted the global fertilizer market?
We know Russia is a major fertilizer producer and also a very important exporter. Sanctions on Russia, particularly on oil companies, have triggered an increase in fuel and natural gas prices in the international market. As we all know, natural gas is a key ingredient in nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea. The surge of fertilizer prices happening right now have influenced farmers' access to fertilizers. These fertilizers are actually essential for farmers to hit their production targets for crops. And the sanctions also cause Russians retaliatory measures, such as, halt its export of fertilizers, oil. These will definitely lead to the decrease of global food output all over the world.
And Marco, do you have anything to add?
For sure, the rise in fertilizer and fuel prices are pushing farmers to cultivate smaller acreage, particularly in developing rural areas, and that will impact yields both for export but also for local consumption, and that's unfortunately a terrible fact. On the other hand, this could also be the reason for beginning to shift and transition towards a type of agriculture that is less dependent on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and move towards a natural regenerative agriculture, which is more resilient, based on a higher diversity of crops. There are some exciting examples in several regions of the world of small-scale farmers that really have embraced this type of agriculture with incredibly positive effects, both on the yields and the production level of their farms, but also in terms of improving more generally the human health conditions and ecosystem conditions in those areas. India is a country that has perhaps most than anybody else show that kind of transition at scale in some of its provinces.
And Marcia, the Biden administration has imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, but it's not pressuring U.S. agricultural businesses, companies to pull out. What do you think of that approach?
Well, let's look at this again in the emergency world situation. It's a matter of fact that over the last few decades, instead of national sovereignty and cooperation among nations, we've had the development of transnationals, and with very famous names, such as in Ukraine, you have ABCD, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus, Louis Dreyfus. And so throughout the world, including in Russia, China, you have a number of companies. Now, they represent capacity. The seeds for wheat in 2022-23 in Russia, much of them come from Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, and from Bayer Crop Science in Germany. We need to override any lesser financial interest and have sovereign governments determine what should be done in the way of seeds, necessary chemicals, fertilizers. And the fact is, the president of Cargill, Mr. McLennan, was at the White House a couple of weeks ago. There wasn't a complaint about him, but it's the elected governments of nations that need to collaborate and determine. Take a precedent. For example, in World War II, when the famous steel mills of Pittsburgh We're not going to produce for the war effort. President Franklin Roosevelt said, yes, you will. And we have to say to the transnationals and to our own farmers who want to farm in Europe and Africa and the Americas and the United States and everywhere, we are going to produce to prevent the death that otherwise we face. Martin Griffiths told the United Nations on April 5th, he's the humanitarian affairs envoy, we could face 325 million dead out of the billion people who are not getting enough to eat this year unless we act. So that's what we should do with our famous name transnationals.
Hmm. And if there's a big drop in the Russian and Ukraine exports in Q2 or second half of this year, but could the shortfall be met by other countries or international organizations? Helga.
Yes, it could, but it would require exactly the approach Marsha was just outlining, because it's a question of policy. If the governments of Europe, rather than insisting to stick to the 30 by 30 set aside rule, whereby 30% of the agricultural land should be set aside, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, the farmers in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in France, they are already with their tractors on the road protesting, because many of them with the present EU policy will go out of existence. I mean, they are fighting for their life work. And we have been talking to many of these farmers who would be absolutely willing to increase the food production, because they have a morality, that they want to produce food for people's existence. And therefore it's not the problem of the farmers, it's not an objective problem, it's entirely a question of a political decision. And I think that some people don't get so upset about what is happening, and I think it has to do with something, which Kurt Schwab said it once in his new book, that the desire for development is what causes damage to the environment. And that kind of axiom thinking, prevents people from reacting to an emergency, which I think, it's one of the great catastrophes of mankind ever, to have 1/8 of all people being in danger. So I think, the decision has to come from the governments. I think the UN General Assembly should have a meeting on, like what we are discussing here, the world food crisis, and then the governments of the world should decide, what measures needs to be taken. But you cannot sit by idly and let the situation go. This will have social chaos. What do you think will happen if there are food riots in Northern Africa, in the Middle East? It's already happening in Peru. People are already at the verge of starvation. And that is when people will not respect the social order anymore. So we are looking not only at a food crisis, we are looking at a complete collapse of this present architecture of the post-war situation. And that is why I'm calling on the governments that they really have to step in and take emergency actions. And sometimes you have to even change what you were thinking before when a new situation arises. So maybe all of these set aside ideas should be dumped, because what should be a priority is the saving of lives. And I think that is what should be on the prime list of the agenda.
Hmm. And Matteo, do you have anything to add?
Um, really, I agree. I mean, this is what should happen. As a matter of fact, we don't know what will happen in 6 months, in 1 year time. What we have observed, however, are two things. First, an increase in the price of soybean and oil palm as a substitute for the reduction of export of sunflower oil. So this is the first thing we observed. The second thing we observed is a change of diet patterns in many households, particularly vulnerable households, that moved their consumption from wheat to less nutrition food, like for cassava. So these are two trends that are actually happening: a substitution of sunflower oil with other crops and a change in diet patterns among the vulnerable groups.
And do you think China would be affected much?
Um, I don't think so because particularly for the import of maize, the maize that China imports from Ukraine, it's mainly used for livestock. So there will not be an immediate effect on the food consumption of people. However, this may have an impact on the livestock. This is possible, definitely possible.
hmm And let's talk about the spillover effects of the conflict, because we've already seen impact on agricultural business stocks. What are other spillover effects that we should pay attention to, Helga?
Well, as I said, I mean, if you have so many people faced with the danger of starvation, it will lead to more regional war. It will lead to more, we are already sitting on a complete powder keg of a potential world war. We have a pandemic which is not under control. And therefore, I think we have to make a real shift in thinking. We need a new paradigm whereby, we have to provide enough food for everybody living, enough healthcare for everybody living, and we have to reorient the economy not to serve the profit of a few speculators, which is what is the case in the transatlantic system right now, but we have to adjust the world economic system for the benefit of the common good of the ordinary people. And that is a change which has to occur. It may go through some more horrible pains, but I think when everything at the end of the day, there will be a recognition that we have to change the system to a more just system, as it was, for example, intended by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who wanted to have a new credit system which would overcome the underdevelopment of the developing countries and increase the living standard of every human being. Exactly what China has been doing with the poverty alleviation. China lifted 850 million people out of poverty. And that economic approach, why should that not be taken to every single country on the planet? This is what every developing country wants. And I think we have to adjust that. And, in a certain sense, we are being tested right now as a civilization if we can do these changes in time when we are threatened with a great catastrophe.
Marco, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I do. I think it's quite clear that when we are facing a crisis, whatever it is, we have two options. One is to move back to business as usual, move backwards, or move forward to and embrace a transition to a new paradigm, new way of thinking, new way of doing things. And I think this is exactly what we need to do now, not just because of the war in Ukraine. That was a crisis. The food crisis has started long before, and the 800 million people malnourished have been there long before the war in Ukraine. The system is broken. The food system today is not delivering for people and is not delivering for the environment. We need to move into a food system that produces more food with less land, less energy, less water, less fertilizer, less pesticides. A food system that doesn't waste as much as we waste today. Up to 40% of the food is lost. And a food system that lives in harmony with nature, producing in harmony with nature, not affecting nature. And one of the risks I see this spillover is that there could be a temptation for countries to roll back environmental protection in the name of increased food production in the short term. And that will be the wrong response. Increase deforestation to make space for more food fields. It is not going to be the right answer because it's going to actually exacerbate the climate change impact, the extreme weather conditions that are today already the cause for an accelerating food crisis. Northern Italy was mentioned before. I just coming back from there. Actually, the crisis in Northern Italy is climate change driven right now. The worst drought, the lowest level of water table and rivers levels on record as affected already before the war in Ukraine the productivity in that region of the world. So we have to stick to a vision that transitions us out of a failing food system and delivers one which is more sustainable, equitable, fair, and resilient.
And I think last month I spoke to an economist from Hang Seng Bank, China. She said Middle Eastern and North African consumers will be the biggest losers as a result of the conflict because they rely heavily on agriculture in exports from Russia and Ukraine. So, do you guys expect this conflict to exacerbate food shortages in these areas, Middle East and North Africa? Marcia, let me start with you.
I'm sorry to say that the future, unless we do something, which we can, you see in the kind of needless hopelessness in Yemen, where you have 17 million people totally dependent on food aid. And remember, as David Beasley, the World Food Program Director, said, half of the food of the WFP was procured from Ukraine. So you see, the answer to this is in the other places of the world outside North Africa and the Middle East. We need an emergency bridge mobilization, whether it's Canada, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina. And those kinds of nation to nation arrangements absolutely must be made. And therefore the fertilizer can be allocated where it will do the most good. And this output is needed for not just, I used the example of Yemen, but Afghanistan. Remember, the entire population doesn't have enough to eat, and over half the population is totally dependent. So it is what in US law is called depraved indifference. If we don't take that as our vantage point from which we make our physical arrangements. And I just want to say, Professor Zhang would know the example, the model that can be used in the whole world of what China did after 1978 with deliberately developing how much area should be cultivated, what kind of fertilizer should be used, what kind of seed should be developed by the famous agriculture seed developer of China. We can do that. It would be wrong to stand back and say this suffering and death has to be inevitable. And our big problem in the United States and Canada, there is a blackout of the dimensions of the human need in Afghanistan and Yemen and elsewhere. The media is completely blacking it out. So many of the farmers, like the American Farm Bureau Federation, that wrote to the Biden administration and said, we want to produce more on the Conservation Reserve Program. Get this land under cultivation. That would be a wave of motivation to do the kind of thing we're able to do. After all, resources are man-made. We need more infrastructure in the longer term, and we can solve this.
And Professor Zhang,
Yes, yeah, as you mentioned, both the Middle East and North Africa heavily rely on Russia and Ukraine for the import of wheat. Unless there is substitute for them, the conflict will definitely exacerbate the food supply for these two regions. However, the conflict, the impact of the conflict does not refrain from these regions. The latest report also showed that West Africa is experiencing the worst food shortage in the decade. More than 27 million people are suffering from hunger. And just as Marcia mentioned, Chinese always attach top priority to food security, as Chinese saying goes. When the grain supply is stable, the world will be in peace. The extreme food insecurity will incite civil conflict. Conflicts may arise as a result of struggle over limited food. This type of conflict vicious cycle will continue unless there is an external intervention for food aid or to end the conflict in question. We know the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, including Sub-Saharan Africa, are fragile. Many are fragile states. This type of vicious cycle will spill over to these regions, and the small and poorest countries and the people in these poorest countries will definitely be affected by this. So we need to take immediate action to stop this conflict, I think.
Do countries like China have the capacity to sort of providing more aid in food to help the rest of the world? Because China is only self-sufficient and is still dependent on certain exports. Professor Zhang.
China achieved self-sufficiency in staple food security like maize, rice, and wheat. And, of course, China rely on export on meat, sugar, and soybeans. But, after we achieve food security at home, China has definitely has the willingness to help other countries. Just most recently, I read the news that China has already provided food aid to Sri Lanka, which has declared national emergency just a few days ago. China also provided food aid to Liberia. So China is, of course, we always cooperate with the international organizations like UN, FAO, WFP to find better solution to addressing these global-wide food crisis.
And Helga, to what extent do you expect food prices to become way too expensive for poor families, and how can international organizations help?
Yeah, it is already the case. I mean, I just saw a documentary about Egypt yesterday, where people, all they mainly eat is bread, if they are poor. And then if the wheat price increases so that the bread doubles in price and triples, that means immediately, you have a starvation level. So it all comes back to what was raised already before, that we need governments to make an emergency plan to, make sure that the necessary seeds, fertilizer, chemical, crop chemicals, fuel gets to the farm beds, that all, measures are given in terms of credit so that the farmers can immediately start this season. I mean, we have now the beginning of April, so an emergency action has to be taken to catch this planting season, and then take more fundamental steps following that. And such a fundamental step would be, for example, to finally implement those infrastructure projects which remedy the situation. For example, there is a project for Africa which is called TransAqua. This would be a very wonderful project to take 3% of the water of the tributaries of the Congo River and bring it to Lake Chad. This project we have been promoting since the late 70s. If it would have been built, Lake Chad would be refilled. Presently, it's only 10% of the water in there, and you could irrigate the entire region of the Sahel zone, and alone that region could produce more food than Africa needs, and Africa could become a food exporting continent, which I think would be very beneficial for other regions which have more difficulties. So this project is one of many basic infrastructure projects, which have to be done to change the parameters to increase the development of the population in such a way that everybody can have a decent food, and it's not the alternative now to reduce meat consumption, which is advertised by some people, uh, because protein is a very important ingredient for a healthy diet. So I think rather than reducing, meat consumption and austerity and all of this, we should have a clear definition of which basic infrastructure projects change the condition for real development for those countries which are in need to do so. And I think that is, if you have a two-tier approach. One is an emergency mobilization to increase the food production, double it, because it's not just 1 billion people which is in lack of food, but we have an increasing world population. For example, Africa will have 2.5 billion people by the year 2050. So we have to start thinking, planning jobs in infrastructure, agriculture, industry now, so that we overcome this horrible underdevelopment. I mean, it's not a natural condition of mankind that 2 billion people have no access to clean water, that half of the population is all the time worried about, can they make it, will they survive, do their children have a future, when it is not necessary. We could have a decent living standard. I'm not talking about luxury yachts for oligarchs. I'm talking about, every child having access to universal education, every child having the chance to develop his or her potential to the fullest, and make this world human. I think that is what we should learn out of this present crisis. And, it would be all possible. Man is the creative species on the planet. What distinguishes us from all other living organisms, plants and animals, is we are endowed with reason. We can discover new physical principles about the universe. This is called scientific and technological progress. And when you apply these discoveries in the production process, it leads to an increase in productivity of the labor force, of the productive capacities,
Right.
and you can increase the living standard of the human population. The entire evolution of mankind up to this point is proven, is the proof that this is the case. So we should
Okay.
apply it for now.
And amid the food crisis, how soon will we see countries start banning exports of agricultural products just to satisfy domestic need? Matteo.
Yeah, no, I definitely think this is what countries should not do. I mean, we have seen in the past already, for instance, during the food crisis in 2008, 2009, that restricting food export may be a short-term solution that brings some advantages, address some challenges in the country that implement these measures, but that result in an increase of food prices globally, so that it's in the end detrimental for the global community. So definitely, if I can make a recommendation to the global community, is definitely to avoid food protectionism, a restriction of food export. This is we have seen it doesn't work, and the consequences are worse than the measure.
Marco, anything to add?
Look, this is from an environmental perspective is quite a complex argument, because on one hand, there are for sure some cases where localizing production and consumption could be beneficial for the environment, less emissions related to long-distance trade, diversification of food, rediscovery of local crops and local food habits. So all that could be good. But on the other hand, in many other countries that imports large amounts of food, this could actually only increase domestic production through intensification, through deforestation, through increased chemical and input that ultimately will not do good for the productivity and for food production in the medium long term. Because as we know, as I said earlier, and science is super clear about this, including the World Food Organization, a healthy, stable climate, healthy, stable natural systems are absolutely critical to maintain and guarantee food security. And the example that was made earlier about Lake Chad is actually evaporating under the effect of climate change. And I'm not sure impacting the forests of Congo to transfer water to Chad would actually do any good, because the forests of Congo today are generating regular patterns of rainfall in most of Eastern Africa. And that's what we need to begin to really think. The unintended consequences. Until now, we have ignored in terms of impact on the environment for other social challenges, whether it is food security, nutrition, whether it is stability, peace. The environment, a healthy environment, plays a fundamental role vis-a-vis all the social challenges and economic challenges of our times.
Yeah, and we do have quite a few development initiatives in combating food crisis. Are they meeting our expectations? Helga.
No, I think right now, I mean, there is this idea of a great reset. Mark Carney, who is now an advisor to the United Nations, he was the governor of the Bank of England, suggested to pay 100 billion euro or dollar to Africa for them to agree to not develop their land. I think that's a wrong approach, and I also think that the Lake Chad question, when you would implement Transaqua, no forest would be hurt, but you would increase the chances for forestation in the Sahel zone, which is now almost a desert. I think the question is how to produce more fresh water, how to combat the desert. I mean, there are many ways of increasing the possibilities for agricultural land if you would do that. And I think in a certain sense there are some projects, but the question is the increase in human activity in order to increase the general level of scientific knowledge is always the way to go, and it's not in a contradiction to the environment. I think China, and Marsha referred to it earlier, China has made the biggest reforestation program in the world. This is not being reported in the West at all. And I think that is the way to go. That it's not a contradiction to have a clean environment and have food production and have technology. I think we should differentiate between physical production and ideologies which are trying to actually reduce development and hold the development. And I think the developing countries right now are extremely sensitized to this. This is why they did not agree to the COP26 program, because they realized that many of the schemes would basically prevent their development. And I think that that is what is right now at stake.
Okay, and I would like to ask all of you about the changes on global politics when a food crisis happens. Helga, let me start with you, just very briefly.
Well, I think what I said earlier, we need a completely new paradigm. We are faced right now with a whole number of existential crises. We are sitting on the verge of World War III, which could lead to the annihilation of civilization. Geopolitics must stop. We must supersede geopolitics with the common aims of mankind. I think what President Xi Jinping has proposed with the shared community of the one humanity is the most suitable model, how we can find the way to cooperate. I think we must convince the Europeans and the United States to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think we should add to the Belt and Road Initiative an agricultural dimension. There is already a cultural Silk Road, a space Silk Road. I think we need an agricultural Silk Road to address this present situation. And we must find a way of cooperating instead of confrontation, because we are sitting in one boat, if we like it or not.
Matteo.
Well, I think that this crisis somehow reminded us that the dream of a world food of free of hunger is far from being reached. We probably we had somehow hopes looking back on the fact that food security was improving globally, but the last few crises, COVID pandemic, a couple of years ago, the Ukraine war now, remind us that this is far from being achieved, and it requires a lot of efforts, commitment at global level to make this happen. So stop the war, avoid protectionism, invest in sustainable agriculture. These are the things that we have to do if we want to achieve a world free of hunger in the next 10 years.
Marcia.
Well, there was a concept that Confucius developed called the ever normal granary that under Franklin Roosevelt in the United States was practiced, that we should be producing sufficient for all and additional reserve for security. That's where it comes from. Now, in the short term, we have an emergency because there are no alternatives that can provide plenty of wheat or plenty of fertilizer right now during the planting season in northern hemisphere and so. But let's do the best we can. If we have a mobilization of contributing governments initiated perhaps by private individuals, groups, and farmers, then we can have the trust that will prevent the kind of bad effects from individual nations withholding exports. Everyone's been doing it, but before this current crisis. And so, and in the longer term, it is a good thing for mankind that projects are being discussed, not just Transaqua in Africa, because Africa was made 40% import dependent on grain, mostly in the north, for decades. No, there are other projects discussed in the model of the Chinese South North or Yangtze Dam approach, like in Egypt, the Toshka project or the Western Desert. And we need to resume that even in Afghanistan, the Helmand Valley Authority based on the TVA. So that's the perspective of win-win approach to the common interest of food for emergency and long term.
And Professor Zhang?
I think we should keep optimistic about international cooperation and the role of development initiatives. You know, as we know, the current volume of food shortage is too large. International organizations do not grow crops themselves, right? They also need to buy from the international market. Yeah, the surge of global food prices will influence their cost as well, just as the World Food Programme's cost has already increased by 71 million a month. That is enough to cut daily rations for 3.8 million people. So from this, we need to be sure that international community can definitely play an important role, and some measures are very effective. Like, you know, they provide advocate for debt relief to poor countries and conduct cash transfer and access to credit to smallholder farmers in poor countries, and promote investment in rural infrastructure, and also provide support to most vulnerable nations. So we should be optimistic about their role. And of course, we also need to be aware that the government of each and every country should be the backbone to win the battle against the worldwide food crisis. If each country can deal with these issues well, they can spare their efforts in helping other countries. And for the developed countries like EU and the US, I know they grow quite a lot of staple crops like maize and soybeans, but they use them for biofuels. And currently, we know a large proportion of these needs to be shifted from biofuels to food production. These will be effective way to achieve global food security. And the last implications, I think, you know, peace and security are most precious thing. War is definitely damaging. The world has already been very fragile. We need to try our best to safeguard the world peace and security.
Okay. And last but not least, Marco.
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say peace between people and peace between people and nature are the two preconditions for building a safe future for us. There is no doubt about that. And so the war, any war, should stop. And so the war between us and nature, which is ongoing right now. And in terms of moving forward, if we are to build a future which is safe, equitable for all on the planet, we need to stop looking backward. We need to stop looking at the old development model that has generated inequality, hunger, wars, and climate change and nature loss, and look at a new development. Still development is, but a new development model, sustainable development, resilient, equitable, in harmony with nature, that guarantees a safe future for all of us.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time and insights, everybody. That's going to do it for this edition of CGTN Live. We had a big conversation about food security today. And of course, vulnerable countries are urgently calling for collaborative efforts to increase food supplies and resume normal planting and harvesting in areas affected by the war. So we hope that we will bring you more good news regarding this. And hopefully the food crisis will never happen in the future. But of course, that's not possible. But we will try our best to protect the planet and your stomach. And thank you so much for your time. This is CGTN Live. Talk soon.